Now that you know about how to calculate a molar mass, I'd like to show you what you can do now that you know the molar mass. And this worksheet has an example that shows you that you can figure out the percentage composition of each of the elements that make up that compound. The example is right here, but I'd like to go and show you how that's done so that you don't get confused. This skill is called calculating the percent composition, and it's based on figuring out the molar mass. And the molar mass is the basis for figuring out what elements make up that particular compound. So if we take a look at the example, I'd like to show you how we get to this answer. And remember that the compound that we're talking about is sodium sulfate. By the way, this is a good time to review how to name ionic compounds. So here's a blank page, and let's talk about sodium sulfate. When we're trying to figure out the molar mass of sodium sulfate, we have to start counting formula units, and remember how that's done. You see that there are 2 formula units of sodium. There's 1 formula unit of sulfur, and there are 4 formula units of oxygen. And remember that you multiply each of the formula units by their individual molar mass. Sodium has a molar mass of 23 grams per mole. Sulfur is 32 grams per mole, and oxygen is 16 grams per mole. And then you multiply across. The contribution from sodium is 46. The contribution from sulfur is 32. And the contribution from oxygen is 64. And if we add that all up, it's 142 grams of sodium sulfate is 1 mole of sodium sulfate. I'm pretty sure you remember how we got to that particular calculation. Well, what can we do now that we're trying to figure out the percentage composition? You can see here that 46 is a certain percentage of 142. And if you review some of the math you learned in previous years, you'll realize that 46 divided by the total being 142, times 100, gives you the percentage, which is the contribution of the 46. And if you did this calculation, you would see that the answer is 32.4%. And in this case, it means 32.4% sodium. What does that mean? It means that 32.4% of the mass of sodium sulfate comes from sodium. That's what that percentage means. Let's take a look at the contribution from sulfur. Sulfur, the contribution is 32, divided by the total, which is 142, times 100, gives you 22.6% sulfur. What does that mean? It means that 22.6% of the mass of sodium sulfate comes from sulfur. And finally, if we take a look at oxygen, 64, which is the contribution here, divided by the total, 142, multiply that by 100 to get the percentage, gives you 45 0.0% oxygen. What does that mean? It means that 45% of the mass of sodium sulfate comes from oxygen.